Well, hello, welcome to my little place here. Today I am going to be teaching online, and I want you to know that I never wanted to be a YouTuber or anything like that, but given the conditions at the web, I have no choice. I'm going to have to be forced to take the webcam and the microphone and just teach you online, okay? So I hope you enjoy it and want to try it. So we'll continue with the course. And if you remember, we're talking about the notion of communicative competence in order to design tests. If I remember correctly, the last thing that we saw was sociolinguistic competence, and so in this lesson we're going to address discourse competence and intercultural competence. So, the first thing that we need to do is just define discourse. Probably some of you have already taken a course that is called Discourse Analysis, but probably not all of you, or probably you haven't taken it yet. So let me tell you very quickly that discourse is nothing but language samples that go beyond the level of the sentence. That means more than one sentence together, and discourse can be oral or written. Normally when it's written we call it a text. Now, in order to understand the nature of discourse and how it works, you're going to do a little task. So go quickly to your discourse competence task 1. You're going to solve this. You're going to pause the video for some minutes while you solve this, and we'll get back to the presentation. Okay. So as you can see from the task, something that is very important about discourse types is that they have an identifiable structure. That means the text that you read was a story. There were 2 stories actually, and of course stories have an identifiable structure, and so do emails or letters or poems. So discourse types are very specific in terms of their structure, and when we see a type of text we can identify it immediately. Second element related to discourse is that the text or the discourse types are connected in a logical way. We call this coherence. So this means that there is a logical flow of the information within our discourse. And the second element is cohesion, because in this case there are also some mechanisms that are used in order to maintain the internal articulation of the text. Now, so as you can see, when we talk about discourse, we're actually talking about all of these elements that we have in a language that make the things that we say or the things that we write logical and well organized. For example, when we express our personal opinion, we may use expressions such as far as climate change is concerned, or personally I think that our economy is going in the wrong direction, or as far as I am concerned, soccer is the most beautiful sport that exists, or my personal view is that, or from my personal perspective I consider that, or concerning a certain topic I think that, or regarding, or I believe that. So if you see, what we need to learn when we learn a language is also how to put our language, our discourse together in a way that people can understand it, in a way that it's logical, in a way that it's organized. We can narrate a story in a chronological order, and in this case we're also going to have some elements that are going to help us to tell a good story so that people can understand what we're saying and they know if we're in the beginning or in the middle or in the end. For example, words such expressions and words such as at the beginning or first, or afterwards, after, later on, then finally, at the end, in conclusion, all. And so we can also present our arguments, and here are some of the elements that we could use. We could number the arguments and talk about first of all and secondly and finally, state a conclusion with therefore, or we can express our agreement or disagreement with someone or with something. This is exactly the same when we talk about advantages and disadvantages. From the moment that we say there are 5 important advantages to put your money in the bank, for example, people know that we are going to present some kind of information, and the things that we're going to say are going to be understood in a better way because they're logical. These kind of discourse markers are actually very important for the B2 level. And of course, when you go up to C2 and C1, you have to use a very sophisticated kind of discourse markers. That's why discourse is very important, and discourse competence plays a very important role in language proficiency. Just to finish this part, I will just show you some other discourse markers that we use for comparing and contrasting. Later you can look at this and just practice some of them for your exams. Okay, in this case you can see that we can organize our discourse and people will know that we are comparing or contrasting. Now, going back to the notion of discourse, there are different kinds or types of discourse according to the purpose or the function. For example, your rhetorical modes can be considered narrative or descriptive or persuasive or argumentative or expository, and these rhetorical modes can be significantly different in different languages. So we need to be very aware, not because we know how a letter is organized in Spanish, does it mean that we know how a letter is organized in English. We're going to do another little exercise. So you have to go to task 2 for discourse competence. You're going to solve the task. We're going to pause the video, and then later we're going to explain why these rhetorical modes need to be basically relearned in a different language. So, as you could probably see, a letter is written and is organized in a different way in English and in Spanish. A university diploma is also written in a different style in English and in Spanish. So this means that discourse competence then refers to the ability to comprehend and produce different types of oral or written discourse. For example, letters, we need to learn how to write letters in English, or how to tell an anecdote, or how to hold and maintain a conversation, how to write text messages. Like text messages, for example, have a very interesting structure, very interesting language. When we write a text message in English, it's simplified, we use abbreviation, we change some letters, and of course they do the same thing in English. So maybe you know how to do it in Spanish, but probably you don't know how to do it in English. So in jokes, for example, jokes can be very difficult. It's not easy to tell a joke and be funny in another language. And also, of course, discourse competence has to do with mastery of all of those mechanisms for achieving cohesion and coherence in all of the different types of discourse. Just as a sort of reflection, I would like you to think about what kinds of discourse you are competent in your native language. And then just try to reflect and think if you can actually carry out the same kinds of discourse in English. About an essay. Are you able to write an essay in Spanish? And can you do it in English? Or a speech? Can you make a speech in Spanish? Do you think you will be able to give a speech in Spanish? And what about in English? Or a joke, as we said. A conference? If you see a conference, for example, is a type of discourse that can only be achieved when you have a C1 or a C2 level. A formal letter is a kind of text that you're expected to write for a B2 examination, telling a story, holding a conversation, writing a poem, giving a lesson, or participating in a debate. So all of these are different kinds of discourse, and speaking the language or being proficient in the language means that we can master all of these kinds of discourse. So discourse competence, as you can see, is a very important element in language proficiency. Now, let's go to the next competence, and the next competence is intercultural competence. First of all, we're going to take a little reflection about language and culture. Something that we need to understand, I think it's obvious to you because you have taken already at least, I think, 3 courses related to culture, is that sometimes understanding a language goes beyond the word themselves, because it requires that you have cultural information. In order to understand this, I'm going to send you to do a little task. Go to Intercultural Competence Task 1. We're going to pause the video for a little while while you solve the task, and then we'll get back to discuss something important about language and culture and intercultural competence. So, as you can see from this little song by Billy Joel, a great deal of the language is dependent on or related to cultural information. Language is culture. In other words, if you saw, you probably understood the lyrics, I mean the words in themselves, the language was probably clear to you. But if you didn't have the cultural reference, you were not able to make sense of the song. And this is something very important. Language is culture, and this is something that is very important for language proficiency. If you don't have cultural knowledge, you will not be able to understand what people are talking about, even if you can understand the individual words and their meanings. Now, talking about intercultural competence, then, we can understand it as the ability that people have to understand behavior from the standpoint of the members of a culture, and then to behave and talk in a way that will be understood by these people in the intended way. So it involves understanding all the aspects of a culture, but particularly the social structure, the values and the beliefs of the people, and the way things are assumed to be done and said. So let's take a little example about what intercultural competence is. If we look at a language such as Spanish, we have words to greet each other like buenos días, buenas tardes, and buenas noches. If we look at French, we have exactly the same types of words or expressions to greet people. equivalent of buenos dias will be bonjour, and the one of buenas tardes will be bonsoir, and the one of buenas noches will be bonne nuit. However, when it comes to culture, you will see that we use these words in a very different way. For example, let's take a look at this. It's 7 a.m. If you see some people and you greet them in a formal way, what are you going to say to people in Spanish? Okay, you're gonna say good morning. What about later when it's 10 a.m.? Again, you're going to see some people and you're still gonna say good morning, right? Now, later at noon, when it's 12, how are you going to greet people in a formal way? If we Mexicans are going to say buenas tardes. And something that I don't know why it's important to us, but if we say good morning and then we realize that it's already 12 o'clock or 12:01, we're going to even apologize with people. I'm going to say, buenas tardes, buenos días. No, más bien buenas tardes. So you're going to excuse yourself because you're going to realize that it's already tardes for you. And I do not understand exactly why, but in our culture that's very, very important. You apologize. If you say good morning and it's buenas tardes, you apologize with people. And of course, so after 12, everything is going to be like that. We're going to say buenas tardes. And what happens in French, ladies and gentlemen? How are we going to greet people in French? At 7 a.m., what are we going to say? Exactly, people are going to say bonjour. What happens at 10 a.m.? People are going to say bonjour. And what is going to happen at 12? I imagine some people are studying French, so what are you going to say in this case? So, people, if it's noon, they are still going to say bonjour. And what happens at 2 p.m., for example, 2 hours later? How are people going to greet each other in a formal way? They will still say bonjour. And what's going to happen at 5 p.m., 3 hours later? People are still going to say bonjour. And what's going to happen, like, let's say at 7 p.m., like, there's still sunlight, as you can see. People are still going to say bonjour. Because actually what is different, from our culture and French culture is that French people will say bonjour as long as there is sunlight. If there is sunlight, they are always going to say bonjour. And you have to understand that in Europe, for example, in the summer, the days are very long. So it may be 8 p.m., 9 p.m., there's still sunlight, people are going to say bonjour. So if you go to France and it's 12 o'clock, or if it's 2 p.m. and you say bonsoir, you are going to be a very weird person. People are going to look at you like you lost your mind or something. Okay? So this is a cultural thing. We have bonjour, bonsoir, bonne nuit. But if you see, we don't use the words in the same way because there is a cultural element. So people in France are actually going to say bonsoir under another circumstances. That is when it's dark. Once the sun is gone and the moon is out, people are going to say bonsoir. But if there's light, they will always say good morning. Now, so then after it's dark, then you can say bonsoir, but you cannot say bonne nuit. Here in Mexico, we use buenas noches to greet each other. For example, you arrive to a party, you see the people, and you're gonna say buenas noches, buenas noches, buenas noches to greet people when you see them, when you're meeting them. But of course, in French, you're going to say, you go to the party and you're going to see people, and you're going to say bonsoir, bonsoir, bonsoir. Because the only time when you're going to say bonne nuit is when you're going to say goodbye after the party is over, or when you're going to bed. But you cannot say bonne nuit when you arrive to the party, because if you arrive to the party and you say bonne nuit, people are going to think that you are already going to leave the party and that you're saying goodbye. So as you can see, language and culture are very, very closely related, and sometimes in order to say the right thing, you need to know about the culture of the language. So, going back to the notion of intercultural competence. Intercultural competence refers to cultural images and symbols, like some of them you could see in the song by Billy Joel, We Didn't Start a Fire. And intercultural competence also involves identifying cultural products, the patterns of everyday life, like when you do exactly what, when you say exactly what to what kind of people in what moment, the cultural behavior, the values and the attitudes of the people. If you see, every culture has different values and different attitudes. Some people value punctuality, and in some other cultures punctuality is not very important. In some places it's okay to say yes or no, and in some other places there are some other ways in which we can say yes or no in a way that is not perceived in a negative way. And some examples of intercultural competence are punctuality and etiquette. Of course, we know that, as we probably already said, here in Mexico, if they invite you to a party, you're normally going to arrive, I don't know, half an hour, 1 hour later, that, and not exactly at the time of the invitation. Whereas in other countries you're expected to be punctual, or sometimes even to arrive earlier. Another example that I wanted to mention is giving directions, because here in Mexico there is something very, very particular. That means that if somebody asks you for directions, we don't want to be rude, and I'm using my air quotes in the word rude. So even if we don't know how to get to the place that people are asking about, we're always going to try to give directions, and then usually we get people lost because we give them the wrong directions. But we cannot say no, we always try to help. And then we're gonna say very crazy things. Disculpe, ¿sabe cómo puedo llegar a la Facultad de Lenguas? Mire, pues creo que si toma ese autobús y se baja 2 cuadras hacia allá y encuentra un Oxxo y da vuelta. We try to give directions, but normally we're not sure. To be honest, most of the times we are not sure. We're sending people, but we're sending people somewhere anyway, just because we don't want to say, I'm sorry, I don't know how to get there. Ask somebody else. In other cultures, if people don't know how to get to a place, they will just tell you, I'm sorry, just ask someone else, I don't know. But here in Mexico, we try to help. and that is part of our cultural behavior. So when we ask for directions here in Mexico, we know because we look at people and we know when they're telling us things and they're not sure, and in this case we ask somebody else and then we get our directions from somebody who really knows. But other people who come from other countries actually follow the wrong directions and then they get lost because we are very, very strong at giving wrong directions. You just have to remember about these expressions, like some people say, pues, ¿ves la casa azul que está del otro lado de la calle, allá al fondo? Bueno, pues ahí no es. Si quieres llegar a tal lugar, vas para allá, pero ahí no es, entonces te vas del otro lado. We just give like really, really messy directions and people get lost all the time. So same thing for yes and no. That means that if people invite us to do something or ask us to do something, we Mexicans are going to say yes, and then we're not going to do it. Like, you want to go to, ¿quieres ir a mi fiesta de cumpleaños? Oh, sí, and we never show up. In other countries, if you say yes, it's because you're going, and if you say no, it's because you're not going. But here in Mexico, yes and no are very relative concepts. And if we look at a very, very typical example is the word ahorita, which has a very particular cultural meaning in English, in Spanish, because ahorita can mean right away, it can mean in 5 minutes, it can be in 2 hours, it can be tomorrow, next week, next month, or never. And also another example that I wanted to tell you about is making and responding to compliments, because here in Spanish we don't make a lot of compliments and we don't respond a lot to compliments, whereas in English people are complimenting each other all the time and they're also responding to compliments. It's a very, very typical cultural behavior that we don't have. So then intercultural competence refers to the customs and the social behavior and in general, and it's very important for proficiency, for communicative competence, because if we don't understand how people behave, how people act in another culture, we're probably just going to have knowledge of the words, knowledge of the grammar, knowledge of the meanings, but we will not be able to communicate with these people in an effective way, and that means that we will not be proficient. So this was all for today. I hope that we're understanding a little more the notion of communicative competence. The last competence that we're going to see in the next lesson is going to be strategic competence, and then later we're going to use all of these elements in order to understand test design and to see how we can design tests that actually can measure this very complex notion of communicative competence or proficiency. So thank you very much, and I will be seeing you next time.